Hey church family, how you doing? Happy Tuesday. Once again, I'm going to be bringing you the words of encouragement. And as I'm thinking about these last few weeks, or even the last month, or even the last few months, if that, we walked into a virus pandemic. And there was 6 feet apart, there was quarantine, and now we are in what one pastor says, we're in a cultural pandemic. And it's not 6 feet apart, it's socially apart. And now, it not only, we're not in quarantine, we're now in curfew. And for a lot of us, we're no longer in curfew, but all of these things are just happening. And sometimes we kind of lose perspective on what God is doing. I love that song called Waymaker, right? And there was a part in Waymaker that I was at a prayer at the pier this past Friday with my family at Huntington Beach, and the fish was holding this prayer at the pier, and it was just about what is going on, whether it be through the virus, through this cultural divide that we are seeing. It kind of put a lot of things in perspective, and one of the first songs that they played was Waymaker, and I love this part where it says, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. And you're probably thinking, Albert, you should have sung it, but I'm not a good singer. So I rather read it, but it's true. And it put a lot of things in perspective. And one of the things that I started to look at is, I was looking at the conversion of Saul, but now as we know as Paul. It says here in Acts chapter 9, Paul has this encounter with Jesus, and now he's blinded, or there's these scales on his eyes, and God summons a man named Ananias and tells him, hey, Ananias, there's a guy named Saul that is coming your way. And Ananias had a problem with this summons that God had for him. And this is what he says in verse 13. But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard many things about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And then the Lord writes, but the Lord said in verse 15, he says to him, go, he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. I will show him how much he has to suffer for my name's sake. In other words, what he was telling Ananias, I have a plan that you don't understand, a plan that I just need you to be faithful. And sometimes God has a plan for us. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes we want to question his plan. And his plan sometimes doesn't feel like it fits the narrative of our thinking. But God's ways are higher than our ways. And then after he does this, he realizes, man, Saul is really converted. God has truly changed his heart. Not only does he change his heart, he baptizes Paul. And after he baptizes Paul, he moves on to this next, part of his new life, where Pastor Joe talked about when the Holy Spirit comes on us. We now become his witness, and that's what Saul started to do. He goes to the temple and he started to tell people about Jesus. But he goes to another time to the temple, or tries to meet with the other followers of Jesus, and they were kind of at a loss, like, oh, who is this guy? And then here in in the same chapter, chapter 9, verse 27, it says, when Saul wanted to go and kind of be with all the other believers, they were kind of standoffish. They were kind of hesitant. And then in verse 27, it says, but Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord who had spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. Why do you, they're probably thinking, okay, Albert, why are you bringing this up? Because the perspective that I got at the prayer at the beach and the song that I heard, and I always say that worship is prayer turned into music. And that's what became my prayer. I wanted God to kind of make sense of it all for me in this whole time. And I wanted God to show me perspective. Perspective. You got to understand, in chapter 9, there was chaos in Jerusalem because of Saul. And now in chapter 9, there is peace because of what God did with Paul. And one of the things that God showed me perspective, especially in that verse in that song, even though I don't see him, he's working. God is never stopping his work. And if us as believers during this time keep our eyes on Jesus, we would see him working, and he would rejoice our heart, and he would remind us, hey, there is still work to be done for my kingdom and for people that don't know me. And let me bring up this next story. And I would say several months ago, my wife found her Spanish teacher from high school Facebook page. And she messaged her and say, hey, I forgot her name, but messaged her basically saying, I'm so excited that I got to connect with you, that I hope that you would respond to this, because I would love to talk to you about what's going on in my life. But she basically wrote, thank you for walking alongside me during the toughest times of my high school year, where I was doing drugs, I was ditching, I was just my wife was being very rebellious. And this Spanish teacher came alongside my wife during her toughest time in high school, and she remembers that, and would even pray for my wife, and was there for my wife's graduation. And ever since that time, she has not heard from her Spanish teacher, but she remembers, after my wife is now a believer, remembers that person. And so this past weekend, my wife gets a response after several months of sending that message. My wife gets a response by her Spanish teacher, and her Spanish teacher was so blessed. And the passage I just said about in chapter 9, we could easily miss out on what God is doing when we don't see him, when we don't feel like he's working. We can be like an Ananias, and truthfully, I felt like I was Ananias. I was like, okay, God, I know that's your plan, but man, it's not fitting the narrative of what I'm thinking right now. And I was getting so confused, so irritated, and so mixed messages in my own heart about what is all going on. And I wasn't even focusing on God. I was focusing only on my perspective at times. And I was getting so frustrated, and it's easy for us to be like Ananias. Ananias was like, no, Lord, I can't do this work because you know this guy. And I can imagine God saying, I know this guy. I have plans for this guy. But if you step out of your way and allow me to do what I do, you're going to see how awesome this is going to be. And I realized that's what I needed to do. I had to surrender to what God has truly, truly called me to do, is to have my eyes fixed on Jesus. And I wish I could have been like Barnabas, even during this time. Barnabas was called the son of encouragement. And I wish I could be that all the time, but I'm not. I'm more of a kind of God questioning person like Ananias. I wish I was more like Barnabas and saying, man, I want to be the son or daughter of encouragement at all times. Even though people were rejecting Saul, but now Paul, Barnabas put his arm around him and kind of just said, hey, I'm walking alongside you. And I believe if God is going to do a work, he's going to do a work, even if I don't believe it, but I'm going to come alongside you. Both people, Ananias and Barnabas, were pretty much doing what God was wanting them to do. One had a little bit of a hesitation, and I believe that's a lot of us. And one was just like, just full being about God's business. Say, man, I'm going to be the encouragement here. And I'm going to stand along my brother Saul and trust that God had done a work in him. And you see, my wife, when she told me about this interaction and the interaction that the teacher had wrote, it was crazy, because the teacher wrote back and says, I'm now 75. I'm immobile. But your message today invigorated me. And imagine, you see, God not only blessed this teacher, but also blessed my wife. You see, when we don't know what God is doing, just rest assured He is working. He is working. If we keep our eyes on Him, He's working. If you're getting frustrated at the TV, pray and ask God, God, you're the peace and you're the justice that people need. You're the God that has all the answers. So if I can give you one last passage, and I know it's been used throughout our words of encouragement. Another devotional, somebody that did it used it, but I think this is a great time to remind us of this passage in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23. It says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For He who promises faithful. God promised us that He would show us great and mighty things that we know not. He promises us that through us, we would help be a part of the process of somebody's life being changed. And He says right here, let us consider how to stir one another to love and good works. Just that message of my wife and her teacher, man, encouraged me. It reminded me to stay focused on God. He's working. He never stops. And we shouldn't either. And then after that, it says, not neglecting to meet together as it is a habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. So church family, I know it's a tough season, but let us continue to stir each other up in good things. And let's start praying for one another. Let's start praying for the things that are going on. Even praying for some of our hearts in this situation, that we may have this questioning thing like Ananias, and we're just like, okay, God, I don't know the answer. Then we need to go to God and we have to ask God, God, give me the answer. I'm sorry that this is a little bit long, but I'm just rejoiceful because God put me back in the perspective that I need to keep my eyes focused on Him, and that the joy of the Lord is my strength because of what happened with my wife. And my wife is rejoicing as well. And I just pray also for the teacher that, even though that she's, immobile, she was encouraged that what she did so many years ago wasn't in vain. It was to the glory of God. So church family, have a blessed day, have a blessed week, and let's keep our eyes fixed on Jesus.